Hello.
Yeah.
Can you span the meeting notes? Sorry, I'm late.
No worries.
Hello.
Zoom is still getting confused between my npmjs.com account and my github.com account.
And we're live. Welcome everybody to another npm Open RFC call. Today's date is Wednesday, October 7th, 2020. We'll be following along the agenda that was posted in the npm RFC issue. I believe it was here. Issue number 248. And I just copied and pasted the HackMD doc. Feel free to add yourselves to the attendee list. Today we want to be a little bit mindful of time. As folks may or may not know, we've been shipping a number of releases of npm 7 and trying to queue up essentially a release that will go into Node 15. Actually, RC3 went into Node 15 master, so you should be able to get it today. But we're hoping to have another one queued up by the end of the week, and then another one for early next week. So with that in mind, we want to shorten the length of the agenda today, and just focus on a single topic, and then hopefully open things back up again next week. So the one item that we actually want to make sure that there was some time and good conversation around is the PR 239. So describing how npm 7 is actually handling peer debt conflicts. And yeah, before we dive into that, again, in these calls, we ask that, please be mindful and respectful of each other, and raise your hand when you get something you'd like to say, and that these calls, as well as all discussions in the RFC repo itself and our repos are covered under code of conduct. And I'll actually give the floor to any folks if there's any announcements before we dive into that topic. If not, I'd love to give the floor to Isaac to maybe dig in on this specific document, which is pretty lengthy. If folks haven't had a chance to look at it yet, please take some time to read through. Maybe you can speak a little bit to what this is sort of outlining for the client.
And I think there's some points in it that I would actually like to change just as we've gone through. As I've been kind of digging through the implementation and looking at kind of like what makes sense, what's the best user experience, what's possible to do. I think probably if we were to zoom out at a very high level, as a user of npm packages, as a consumer of them, I generally want my deps to install, and if there's a problem in the peer dependencies of one of my dependencies, the status quo up until now has been, well, we'll just install it and you get what you get and you don't be upset. With kind of the legacy peer deps approach. There are two things that I think are then kind of reasonable things that fall out of that. Sorry, just to back up a step. The other thing I want as a consumer of packages in the npm registry is I want them to not have conflicting peer dependencies. I want them to, be well tested and high quality and like work in the way that I expect, and not randomly break when I install something because now all of a sudden it's getting a version it can't support. So these are somewhat in conflict, right? Because the simplest way to make install time just work is we just don't install peer deps. That's what we've been doing. And the simplest way to ensure that that whatever does install actually works and is tested is we are super, super strict. And we just, like the initial kind of npm 7 betas, crash if there's any unresolvable peer dep setup. So the way that we're trying to thread this needle is if you opt into strict peer depths, then any conflict at any stage effectively is a crash, right? We say, nope, there's a conflicting peer depth here. I can't find a resolution. You're, no install for you. If you set legacy peer depths, obviously we'll work the same way that we previously did. We just don't even look at peer depths. And that's way on the other side of the spectrum. If you set, but then in this middle ground, what we're shooting for is effectively, if the peer depth conflict is your fault, then we crash the install. We don't do the install for you. If the peer depth conflict is not your fault, it comes from a dependency that you're pulling in, or you're installing a dependency and two of its dependencies have conflicting peer depths, and it specifies a third version, maybe, like, we'll just kind of do what is the most likely, the most reasonable kind of resolution that we can, which will get you by. And so I think this is reasonable. I've talked to a number of you about this, and it seems like it's kind of the best compromise to sort of get us forward so that npm 7 isn't sort of overly pedantic and DOA, but also, does kind of nudge the development community towards having, non-conflicting peer dependencies by alerting them much more forcibly when it's a problem in their own project. And then the third thing to add on to that is if you set force, because even if you have a peer depth conflict and even if it's your fault, you may want to fix something else first, and now you just need to install. So shut up npm, get out of my way. That's kind of what the -f option is, right? Just force it. I don't care. It's broken, whatever. And so we have this sort of spectrum where strict is crash on anything, non-strict is crash when it's my fault, and force is never crash on anything, just power on through. The one thing that I think is a little bit of a discrepancy in the RFC and with the current release candidate versions is even in non-strict mode, we are crashing for peer dependency conflicts that are not caused by your project if we could not determine what the appropriate resolution would be. And I think in those cases, that the change I want to make to this RFC is in those cases, if it's not your fault, we should probably still just behave as if it's forced, and take the first one that was placed there, because you're not in a position to fix it, so crashing is kind of rude. So I'll open it up to the rest of everybody to chat about. I don't know if I know Jordan has some feelings on this. I know I'm guessing Christian and some others do as well.
Yeah, I don't see any hands raised, so I'll jump in if that's cool. I think I can completely understand the sort of marketing angle of if it's too complainy, people aren't going to be happy and they may be less likely to upgrade to it and so on. And I don't mean to minimize it by calling it that. It's just a different kind of constraint and concern than correctness or technical limitations and so on. And I think that that's a pretty compelling reason to not make strict the default for now. That said, even if yeah, I mean, so that's fair. But I meant by technical, I meant like, it's about feasibility as opposed to, or like can you achieve it, right? And
right.
Yeah, so it's important, and I'm not trying to minimize it. I think that the reality, though, is that if somebody's peer depths are invalid, if strict would fail, then there's kind of two main scenarios that we're concerned about. One is somebody upgrading to NPM 7 on a dependency tree that already seemed to work. The other is somebody already on NPM 7 adding a new dependency. The upgrade from 6 to 7, it's completely out of their control. The dependency graph worked. Like, they shouldn't have to fix that in order to upgrade to NPM 7. Like that's the worst outcome, I think, for having strict on by default would be the people in that bucket. But once somebody's already on a strictly valid dep graph, and then they add a new dependency, I think that the correct thing is that they're blocked. They can't add that package because its peer deps are invalid. It's incompatible, right? Like, they should have to jump through hoops to invalidate their dep graph, even if it's the fault of another project maintainer. And I as a project maintainer who participates in many ecosystems where invalid peer deps cause lots of subtle bugs that are hard to track down and triage, such that, like, my issue templates and automatic refrain at this point is, does npm ls exit 0? If not, everything's broken, go away, like, essentially, because that sniffs out a lot of these problems. So I think that it would be much better for usability for these users to get blocked when they try to upgrade their version of React or ESLint or Babel or whatever, than to be blocked a week or two later when they thought everything was working, but then they have some weird bug and now they have to like rope in a maintainer to like burn up hours of time trying to figure out what the real problem is. When I've suggested a middle ground between those two, like two scenarios, it's correctly been called out as being too magical. So I don't really have a better solution. But I think that that it is vastly important that somebody not be able to, like, not just unknowingly, but not at all, invalidate their valid dependency graph. Like, warnings are nice, but my experience is that people don't read words. So unless the exit codes are non-zero, they're not going to pay attention by and large.
What we could do, one idea that might be less magical, although unfortunately less effective, would be if we run an install, there's no peer dep warnings, and strict is not on.
Mm-hmm.
We could print a message that says, hey, you should run this. Like, you should run npm config set strict peer deps equals true, and that might at least encourage them to opt into that for those projects.
That seems better. I mean,
but I think as much as people don't read warnings when there's errors, they even more don't read notices and warnings when there aren't errors.
Right. Yeah, I mean, so I think that's a good idea. It hurts like 0 to add it, and it helps potentially non-zero. But yeah, I agree with you. It's unlikely to be super effective.
Yeah, it is a little bit of a cost, just because everything we say has some small but relevant impact on kind of the overall noisiness.
I mean, potentially we could also have a config value, like, for noisiness, right? That suppresses the warnings, not force, but like, because I think that has slightly different semantics, but something that just says, like, hush, I already know about this. But I don't know if that's helpful.
Christian, did you have something you wanted? I think you're muted. Christian, I think you're muted.
Shit. So yeah, I do agree with Jordan in that we should probably try to be as strict or as noisy as possible to get people to fix their dependency graphs. However, the question is a bit like, do we want to be more strict in NPM 8 in the future? And then another thing, would I be able to set a default in npm RC? Because I think that would be super useful if you, for example, are a package author and all you basically do is something that you wrote yourself and you always want it to fail.
So sorry, you're asking for a similar flag to what Jordan just mentioned, like a similar silence of warnings, or?
No, actually, just what Isaac just wrote in the chat, that you can actually set a config so that it will always be strict.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, that and the fact that I can do that globally is nice, right? It means that I can, like, I have hundreds of projects and I can get those warnings and not force other people to deal with them. Like, so that there's something there. But like the audience I'm most concerned about is not the developers who know to do things and turn things on. It's the ones who report problems and thankfully don't know the inner workings of NPM.
I mean, another take on this, like from the whole like warnings are ineffective point of view, is that we are reducing the noise considerably with NPM 7. And this is a very, very noisy warning. It's multiple lines, and it shows info about the graph of dependencies that led you to that place and so on. So I think it may be more impactful than, for example, the previous ineffective like pure deps missing warnings, right? Because it actually tells you what's going on and what the problem is in a way that previous things didn't really. And we don't have like node build, binary build output and other scripts and a billion other things flooding your screen at the time. So it does stand out a little bit more. Assuming you're not using lots and lots of deprecated packages.
Someone mentioned this, I think, 2 weeks ago, that a lot of those builds are run in CI and you never ever see those. And I think in those cases, the warnings don't really make any difference at all.
True. I mean, a majority of the builds are happening in CI, but you still do run npm install on your local machine, right? Even if it's
true, yeah.
Even if you're running 100 builds a day in CI, you're still probably running it once every day or two on your local machine. And given how much people complain about our other warnings, somebody is seeing them. I'm not really hearing any other objections about the fail when it's mine and force when it's not default, though. I think
that's like the only. Wow.
Well, I do have I think it's more of maybe a clarification on the algorithm you explained in the beginning, Isaac.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it is not going to fail. It is going to succeed if a dependency is higher up in the tree, right? Like closer to the top level, so that we can reasonably say that this is probably the safest one declared within the tree. But if at the same level you have competing and conflicting versions for a given dep, then it will still fail, right? The install.
Well, that's kind of the change that I'm suggesting. I think really if it's not your dependencies that are conflicting, so the situation that Roy is alluding to, let's say I have a package dependency, I depend on X. X depends on a particular version of Y and a particular version of Z, and Z has a peer dependency on a different version of Y. So in that case, there's no, it's very likely that like in X's root project, it would fail by default. And B, if I'm installing X, there's probably no way to get a version of Z that's going to get the right version of Y because of this explicit dependency coming from the thing I'm actually installing. In that case, we just go with the version that X wanted, because I'm installing X. X has a specific non-peer declared dependency. In past times, like that's the one that would end up getting installed anyway. It's probably the one that has actually been tested, in spite of what the peer deps say. So we go with it. There's another case where, say, I depend on package X. It depends on packages Y and Z. And Y and Z each have a peer dependency on W, on a conflicting version of W. So I have no clear indication of like which thing is higher priority, right? X doesn't declare a dependency on W. There's nothing else referencing it except these two peer deps, which are for two different versions of it. In that case, the RFC states that we will still crash in non-strict mode if it's a nested dependency. And what I would like to do instead is say, because this is still kind of the case where I'm not in a position to fix it, it should just take the first one that it placed. So essentially Y would win because it's, willy-nilly, it's earlier in the alphabet. So that's why. And I think that actually is a little bit more, both more consistent and a better overall user experience. For all the same reasons why we wanted to take the version of Y that X specified. We also want to take the version of W that was just pick one of them. It's fine.
Well, I'm really afraid that could lead to broken installs, right? Like we can successfully install the install tree, but then the application would just not run, right? Because one of the dependencies was expecting W in a different version and it's just not compatible, right? So you end up in a situation where, okay, npm install succeeds, but still like your app is not really usable anymore. That's the kind of thing I'm afraid of.
In that case, it would have been even less. So we're not making things worse, going from yarn or pnpm or npm 6 up to npm 7. Like, it hasn't gotten meaningfully worse. In fact, in this kind of a case, we wouldn't have installed W at all, right? So the whole, it would be even less functional.
So maybe, so that's just one thing I would float. Maybe it's a terrible idea. Maybe someone will have a better idea than this. But what if we just do the step that people would usually do in this case, which is place W in your top level dependency just to mark what you're picking up, right? Like just automate that, so that like whatever we resolve them, because or whatever, right? Y comes first in the alphabetical order, but just pick that W and put it as a top level dependency just to mark that, okay, this was what we resolved to. And then we'll also give the possibility like to the user, not only bubble up to the final user, but also giving them the possibility to tweak it, right? And select a different version if that would be the best for the project, right? In order to fix their application.
I mean, wouldn't that put you in a position though where the conflict is with your root project and now we crash the install because you have conflicting peer deps that are your fault?
Oh, maybe. But at the same time, I thought we were always like preserving the topmost definition as being like the good
winner
one.
Yeah, but we crash if that's a conflict unless you do force. Because in that case, you should fix it, right?
Right.
But there's no way that you can fix it here because it's not actually your dep. It's one of these.
But that might be disturbing, like from the world coming from npm 6, where we're not installing anything and everybody has like the dependencies declared in their top level deps or dep deps, or right, in order to get them installed. Then we might actually be crashing for these people trying to migrate from npm 6.
Right. Well, I mean, they would be able to do strict. I'm kind of less concerned with. I guess maybe I'm kind of less concerned with somebody who's like using a bunch of React modules and has specified a version of React that doesn't work with them than I am with somebody who's like just building a website with Gatsby or a CLI with Ink and, buried 3 levels deep, there is a conflicting peer dep on React or Babel or whatever else. which is pretty common, as well as like I just want to use this TypeScript thing. It has a peer dep on a thing that some other TypeScript thing I'm using doesn't agree with. Like, shut up and give me my codes, right?
Just
So
be
there's-
mindful of time here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. We can go over, obviously we've got the full hour block, but did want to make sure that we stayed on point and tried to actually surface any, clear objections to the current way this is going to be handled. So.
Yeah, Kristen, I think that's a good idea to save up these warnings and print them at the end of the install as well. We had talked about doing that with some other things. So it's kind of at a similar priority level to audit output. As it currently is implemented, the warning gets printed very early in the process, before all the the flood of deprecation notices, and it certainly does get somewhat buried as a result. So saving them up and printing it at the end is definitely easily done. I think there's, Roy, you're kind of touching on an interesting concern here that I think needs maybe a little bit more like testing and evaluation. And we'll certainly see more as people are using it more widely, which is the difference between, and it's kind of getting to somewhat of Jordan's point as well, like there is sort of a functional difference between, I do a git checkout and an npm install with just like whatever's in the package lock and or just whatever's resolved from my package JSON dependencies, versus I'm adding a new dependency to the tree. And so, I don't know that we've captured exactly like what the best solution is to that, but I think that it feels like there's something relevant, there's something meaty in terms of like that, just the difference in those two use cases.
So that does suggest a less magical form of what I'd previously suggested. npm install could, but with no arguments, could continue to have the middle ground non-strict thing that you've been talking about. But then when you explicitly attempt to install like npm install foo, could we make that pick strict or non-strict based on the current validity of the tree? Meaning if it's valid, it adds a new package in strict mode, and if it's not, it doesn't.
I mean, I think effectively the new thing you're adding is kind of always in strict mode, because it's your, oh, I guess no, unless it has some peer.
Yeah, like it could have some
like
peer
levels
requirement.
Down, yeah, it has peer depths.
Yeah. Like that would at least mean that would still achieve what I want, which is where once your graph is valid, you can't easily make it invalid.
Right. So the way we currently do package additions, if you do npm install foo, we basically just slap that onto the, well, so we resolve that to figure out, okay, what version will it actually be, and what is the name of the thing. But then we just basically add that to your effective package JSON dependencies and proceed with attempting to resolve the tree, right? Doing the whole breadth first search queuing kind of thing. So it might be, I'm just trying to figure out, I'm just kind of doodling on like what that would mean for like if we had a different level of strictness based on whether something was in the explicit requests.
Well, like presumably you could store in a lock file the validity status of the tree, right? Like would it have failed on strict or not?
Mm-hmm.
And so if there's a lock file present and I do npm install foo, if the tree was valid, then you can just implicitly set the config to be strict and move forward. And if you know it wasn't, then you just move forward without changing anything. I don't know how that would work if you didn't already have a lock file. I don't know if you can figure that out you build the tree prior to adding the new one.
You actually always have a lock file.
Okay.
Little hidden secret. In npm 7, there's a node module / .package lock.json, which it's not quite the same as a lock file. It's a snapshot of the latest actual tree.
So it's not a lock file in that it's not constraining, but it's like a cache of the full tree information or something.
Yeah, and we just if any of the folders referenced by any of the packages in that lock file have a newer M time, then we just say, okay, this cache is invalid and throw it away. But that lets us that basically lets us do a load actual in under 50 milliseconds versus like a second and a half for really big projects. So it's a pretty significant performance improvement. PNPM and I believe at least Yarn 2, I don't know about Yarn 1, do something very similar.
So is there any updates we have to make based on that feedback, based on it's essentially implementation? Like, I have to go back through this spec, but what would have to be changed?
So the change I intend to make is there is one edge case where we're in non-strict mode and it's a meta dependency that conflicts. It's a meta dependencies peer deps that conflict, and we can't find a reasonable declaration of intent. We should still let the install proceed because it's not yours. It's somebody else's fault. And even though that means proceeding with something that we have no reason to believe is any better, it's the first one that we encountered alphabetically, and so we just take something like we would in force mode. The other things I think are actually really beyond that. Like, should we infer strict mode when adding new deps, or should we capture whether or not there were warnings and infer strict mode if last time there were no warnings? I think that these probably rise to the level of having their own RFCs and feel a little orthogonal to sort of like, what do we do, just the basic idea of like, what do we do in strict mode? What do we do in force mode? What do we do in non-strict mode? And then from there, we can say, okay, well, here are the cases where we'll default to strict mode or default to non-strict mode or whatever.
Is there any way to expedite that? Like in terms of like how many scenarios are we considering?
How do you mean?
So like you're saying that you potentially want to open up RFCs for those specific like modes. Is that
right?
correct?
Like for Jordan's default strict idea.
Well, but as an RFC though, I mean, wouldn't that make it a breaking change? Because then npm install foo. Well, I guess no, theoretically, yeah, npm install foo would then be in strict mode at times, and you'd be unable to add a dependency. So it kind of like, right. I mean, we can do it, but if it's waiting for npm 8, then like at that point, I'd rather have an RFC that says everything's strict.
Right.
Well, let's ask for the moon. You might get something. You might get like a space station or something. It could be. I think it could be a reasonable step towards that. I also think we're probably sort of at the we're definitely nearing the end of or past the end of where we can add new breaking changes. Arguably, even doing any kind of strict mode or non-strict mode is kind of a breaking change. So it's any adjustments to this does adjust kind of the semantics of how we build trees. And that's one reason why I want to get it out while we're kind of still in RC territory. And RFC 2, but I think on day one with npm 7, it would actually be really helpful if we said, the plan for npm8 is, one of these two options. One is it's strict by default after the first non-warning install. Option two is it's strict by default always. And we should probably have an RFC for whatever we end up going with, right? And we got plenty of time to do that. But yeah, it is probably a breaking change. And I would love for peer deps to have always been strict, but the question is kind of how we get there.
So what we have today is not what, to Jordan's point, is not strict on install.
Right. So what we have today is it's strict when it's yours and it's forced when it's not.
Wait, when you say yours, what do you mean? Like top level?
I mean that the conflict is between the peer deps. The conflict is between one or more peer sets, which are dependencies of the root project or a workspace project.
Okay.
And so if it's a meta dependency of the root project or a meta dependency of a workspace, then we just kind of let it ride. So I think that actually handles most cases where npm install foo would bring in some new conflict, because it'll assuming it's not many layers deep within the dependencies of foo, if it conflicts with something that's already a top level dep and you're adding a new top level dep that conflicts, then it will crash. So it will prevent you from creating new peer conflicts that are your fault.
That's true if every direct dependency of my project correctly repeats its own dependencies peer dep requirements. When they fail to do that, and the peer dep requirements of their deps are just transparently hoisted up, then that will not trigger the issue. And that is, in fact, the buggy scenario that I see the most often.
Right. I installed Express foo or React foobar.
And React foobar depends on something else that correctly says it only works on React 16 or something, but then it doesn't declare that, and I have React 17. It will merrily let me add that and create the conflict.
I mean, ironically enough, the other thing about this is if the more layers of nesting that there are, right? So the more kind of non-peer dependencies exist in this chain, the more likely it is that we can find a satisfying resolution, but it could have the unintended side effect of now there's two Reacts in your tree, right?
Right, that's also not that's actually worse than failing entirely. Right, and React at least detects that on the page and complains, so people are more likely to eventually figure it out. But most peers do not go to the extra mile to check for that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think we could have a whole other kind of deep dive on different kind of cultural mores of dependency declaration within different peer dep communities. But one thing that seems very common within them is in order for it to work at all, it has to become, and it typically does become very widespread for everyone to declare a peer dep on kind of the central thing.
On the core thing, yeah.
Yeah, so like in the React community, you very, very rarely see React modules that don't declare a peer dependency on some version of React. It happens, but like the reason why we encounter these conflicts is because everyone's declaring a peer dep, and some of them, decide to pin it to some particular React version, which is sort of unnecessarily strict. In some other peer dep communities, I think I believe it was, I want to say ESLint, and maybe also in Babel, it's a little more it's a little more likely that either a peer dep won't be declared or there'll just be a direct dependency on something that has a peer dep. But also, it's a little bit less breaky than it is in React. Is kind of the worst of the worst in terms of like it must be a singleton or everything falls over.
I mean, I would say that shared configs like the Airbnb ESLint config have similar issues. Like the Airbnb config has like 5 major peer deps, all of which themselves peer depend on ESLint.
Yeah.
So like, if you follow the laborious instructions in the README, you don't run into problems. But anyone who doesn't often does. So
laborious instructions are laborious.
Yeah.
So just to be mindful here again, we're a few minutes over what we want to be, but what's like the next steps here?
Well, I got to finish fixing this arborist bug so that it actually does what the RFC says. I'm going to update the RFC to make these changes that I have sitting in my Vim buffer right now, to be basically always forced when it's not your fault and always strict when it is. And then, yeah, we should do another RFC to figure out what's going on or what we hope to do with NPM 8. And I think that would actually be useful to do now, because we can have our warnings be a little bit more forceful and say like, this will break with NPM version 8.
Yeah.
Sounds good to me.
Also, to just in terms of my earlier comment, I think I'd be happy with just a few test cases on Arborist that demonstrate that kind of those scenarios and how it should behave.
They are super, super laborious to write, those test cases. It requires, some of them require like many levels of dependency nesting and stuff, but I have them in progress.
Yeah. Maybe it would be nice to have just something, from like very popular thing in there, like create React app and just like, try to add a new thing and like how it should behave, right? Okay.
Yeah, I've been shying away from using, like I sort of test with real world projects, but I've been shying away from using them as test cases specifically in our test suite, because they're really hard to pin down, like, and isolate a particular scenario, and tend to have like many dependencies. So that test fixtures folder is already pretty massive.
Yeah, maybe not as part of the unit test, but maybe just a one-off spin off of the test that just kind of assert how it's behaving right now with these.
Sure.
Cool.
Cool. Was there any other comments or feedback on this? I've taken a bunch of notes here and also logged down like the next steps or action items from this. With the changes, Isaac, would we then also consider this to be essentially ratified, since we're basically having built the functionality at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's much more ratification we can do than shipping it, which we're going to do. So
yeah, fast and furious. Okay. So that's another thing also to keep mind of then to close this out.
Yep.
Anything else? Any other comments or feedback on this? Sounds like the other to do here is to open up another RFC specifically for changing the default strictness mode. Is that accurate? Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah, in NPM 8.
And we can kind of discuss whether we want that to be implicit or explicit or a nag or or what. Okay.
Cool. Well, I appreciate everybody jumping on again today. And I apologize, we didn't have more of an agenda. We're all going to get back to typing on keyboards, and we'll be back at it next week, hopefully with a larger list of things to chat about. So I will speak with you all in Slack or in the RFCs themselves, and hope you have a great day.